Well, I will officially welcome you, greetings, and welcome to the 107th NCA Annual Convention. We're so very pleased to have you here today. I'm Roseanne Manzik. I'm currently serving as the first vice president of NCA, and I'm also the principal planner for this year's convention. And it's just my great pleasure to serve today as your official welcomer, but also as moderator for the program and our opening session here this afternoon. It's going to be a fantastic discussion, and we're so pleased to see all of you here joining us. Please do remember that following the session, right next door, we have our opening reception. And our welcome reception for the convention. So please join us for that as well. And of course, many other wonderful things coming up in terms of our general sessions. I'm just going to mention two. One tomorrow is our Carol C. Arnold lecture, which we hope you also join us in this room at 5 o'clock for Dr. Tina Harris. And Saturday at 5 o'clock, we'll have our presidential address from Dr. David McMahon and also our awards ceremony. And those are our wonderful full community events, among many things. So I hope you're enjoying yourself so far. And I'm again pleased to welcome you here. Today's opening session, Honoring Past and Present, Communication, Culture, and Change in Native Seattle, will explore issues that are relevant to Seattle's many Indigenous and Native American communities. Now, the greater Seattle area is home to nearly 30 federally recognized Native American tribes or nations, and several more that have long histories in Washington but are not recognized by the U.S. government. These peoples have rich and meaningful connections to the land and to the sea. They communicate using not only sacred language, but art, ceremonies, and traditions as well. So this afternoon, we'll explore the role of communication in addressing and overcoming challenges facing Indigenous and Native peoples, both specifically in Seattle and more broadly in the U.S. Now, before we start, I would ask that we pause for a moment of reflection. And NCA asks you to join us in acknowledging the Indigenous communities and their elders, both past and present, within not only the Seattle area, but Washington State as well. NCA acknowledges that it is often gathered upon unceded lands, and that those gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular, the erasure of both Indigenous and African American identities via slavery and via racist laws that segregated all peoples into binary classifications of white and black. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And before we get started, I also want to invite you to join in celebrating the fact that here we are gathered in Seattle, in these native lands, and amongst these Indigenous communities, and it is the first year that we officially have an Indigenous caucus within our National Communication Association, and that is just something worth celebrating. So we have 5 expert panelists with us here this afternoon. These individuals are teachers and scholars, community leaders, artists, activists, and members of Seattle's Native community. With us are Esther, Lucero, Royce, Batchelor, Abriel, Johnny, Scott Pinkham, and Eean Grimshaw. And I will serve as your moderator for the discussion. But I'd like for the panelists to introduce themselves first and tell us a little bit more about their work. But first, I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication and Society, which was founded by Dr. Brian Crable, a communication professor at Villanova University. We appreciate Waterhouse's support in creating this space for dialogue about these important issues and socially relevant conversations. So thanks. And let's have the panelists introduce yourselves. So, and you can go in any order you'd like.
Okay, I'll start. My name's Abriel Johnny, and I identify as Indigenous. I am Cowichan from up in Vancouver Island, Canada, on my father's side, and Tlingit on my mother's side from up in Sitka, Alaska. I serve as Community and Tribal Engagement Manager with Healthier Here, which is working on the Medicaid transformation waiver in Washington State. I am also the chair for the Board of Directors for United Indians of All Tribes Foundation and serve as co-chair for the Seattle Women's Commission.
Yate everybody, my name is Esther Lucero, and I am Dene on my mom's side, and I'm Latina on my dad's side. The title I wear the most proud is Mom. I am the mother of a beautiful little boy named Elias, and I am also a wife and a daughter and a sister. And here, my community role and responsibility, I'm really privileged to serve as the president and CEO for the Seattle Indian Health Board. And really to try to guide transformation within the city of Seattle. And in addition to acknowledging all of the atrocities, caused by past efforts to eliminate us and continued through settler colonialism, I'd like to acknowledge our strength, because we are all sitting here in front of all of you because we are powerful, resilient, strong, culturally centered people. And so when you tell that story, you have to tell the whole story.
Halito anin bosu komsquaze mesu misineque Indigenous cause migizu dudem makwa ikwe kokam Winnipeg nindunji ninmineoya. I am Dr. Royce Batchelor. I introduced myself in Ojibwe. I was born by my mother, brought into this world through Chickasaw blood, and my grandfather Choctaw. But I live in Canada, and the elders there of Ojibwe language have been so gracious to include me in their community. So they had taught me how to introduce myself in their language, Ojibwe. That introduction is, my name is Light Redstone Woman. I am Eagle Clan. My students call me Bear Mom. I live in Winnipeg, and I am so very happy to be here. I was in the academic world for almost 30 years. I was an experiential, phenomenological scholar and teacher. And I left academia very recently, 3 years ago, when I discovered that I could no longer serve my Indigenous students to the extent that I wanted to. So I launched a venture, it's called Clever Crow. Clever Crow serves to help organizations examine their language, their policies, their procedures, to deconstruct toxic structures of power.
Hello, my name is Eean Grimshaw. I'm a professor at North Carolina Wesleyan College in North Carolina in Rocky Mount. I'm actually non-Indigenous, but I consider myself to be an Indigenous ally. I primarily work with the Blackfeet, the Amskapi Pikani, in northern Montana around issues of language revitalization, land reclamation, sovereignty. And I believe that my primary role here today is to support these other voices alongside our budding and growing Indigenous caucus. Again, I consider that to be a huge milestone moment for the discipline and for our ability as scholars, both Indigenous and non, to support those voices and to cultivate that momentum and that movement forward.
Tatskalawat, Inuas Samawok, or Scott Pinkham. Thank you all for coming here. Again, I'm here with hopefully bringing some experience. I work at the University of Washington, where I've been a part-time lecturer for American Indian Studies since about 2000, and taught classes on contemporary issues, powwow, and also proposed and taught a class on urban native experience. I am married to my wife, Vicki. She is Tlingit, and our daughter, Molly, is here, and we're also foster parents to a Red Lake Nation child who we've had since she's 3 years old, and she's a junior now in high school. And I just appreciate everyone coming out here to learn, because I think that's what we need people to do. You know, what you don't know often gets us in trouble. So come out and learn, and communication is what we need to do today. Katsayo, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for those wonderful introductions and for the exceptional work that you're doing with your research and in your communities. So let's go ahead and get started. As I began with, NCA recognizes the Native peoples of this land on which we hold this very conference. And as individuals who study, live on, and are part of these lands, I wonder if you can speak to how land acknowledgements can go beyond just words.
I clearly picked the wrong seat. No. Land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements should be coupled with relationship building. A land acknowledgement itself, shared without relationship building, is a checkbox, and it's a tokenistic gesture unless the organization, the city, the government, whoever is providing that land acknowledgement actually reaches out and develops that relationship to construct the language of the land acknowledgement, therefore supporting the self-narrative of the tribes and the land that they're on, and supporting and constructing or having the conversations about what actions actually follow that, so that it isn't a checkbox anymore, to understand what the tribe needs in that form of support. So the land acknowledgement should acknowledge the land that it's on. It should acknowledge the peoples, because it's not just the land, it's the peoples. They're all, it's one and the same. It's all the same relatives. And it should have a call to action that the organization has made a commitment and a dedication to follow that call to action, and that call to action should consistently be progressively pushed forward. I'll stop there.
I have to say, the thing I like about land acknowledgements is it's like beginning to fuel people's responsibility in researching the land, that they are on, and the original peoples of that land. So that's the part I like, and perhaps the only part. I think I agree with Abriel when it comes to thinking about land acknowledgements as a checkbox. And to me, the way I look at it is, once you've identified that you are a guest on someone's land, then it only means something if you behave that way. So if you go into someone's home, right, you ask permission to be there. You take special care, you clean up after yourself, right? You treat their home with a tremendous amount of respect. And I think that all of us have a responsibility. We're all on this land today. It's not my land. I walk on as a guest on this land as well, to treat this land in that way. And so until you do that, then you will always remain an ally and never reach the status of an accomplice.
I spent a lot of time studying land acknowledgement statements. In Canada, we have something called the TRC, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was designed to be a response to residential schools and the trauma that they created. And one of the 94 actions you might take is to acknowledge the land you're on. But it really needs, as others have said, I appreciate the gesture, but it really needs to go far beyond that. Because in putting a city of this size here, there are other relations that were eliminated other than what we would call the two-leggeds. There were entire populations of animals that were displaced, trees that were deforested, and if you fly over Seattle, that's quite evident. So there is a level of devastation that has occurred that many land acknowledgement statements negate. And we are guests here. The trees have been here far longer than we have. The rocks have been here far longer than we have. So to remove them and erase their existence is just as traumatic to me as someone who has stones as her medicine. It's just as traumatic to me as seeing entire populations removed forcibly from their lands. So we do need to treat the land with a certain degree of respect. The land acknowledgement statements are a great place to start, but we also need to acknowledge that this was a failed experiment and it's time to repair and restore that relationship. So it's also time for those next steps. Aho, miigwech.
I'll just echo what Royce said, that I think it makes a good first step, but that has to be followed up with subsequent actions. I think heavily in the realm of education, where a land acknowledgement only means so much if you stop there and not follow that up with understanding those relationships, understanding, in some cases, the multiplicity of Indigenous peoples who lived or perhaps claim their ancestral homelands on a shared land base. It gets complicated very quickly. And I think oftentimes in today's day and age, we like to have clean-cut, easy solutions. Black, white, yes, no. And when it comes to land acknowledgements, it's not that simple. It requires a deeper thinking, a deeper understanding, not only of who those people are, but what their relationship was with those lands. I know that when we think about Seattle, we, those of us who are non-Indigenous visitors and guests upon this land, are very grateful for the waterfront. We're very grateful for this majestic location that we're in. And perhaps we don't consider how the salmon have been devastated, or how killer whales, orca, have been, what's a nice way to say this? Taken advantage of and threatened through things like marine coastal testing that various organizations or companies may do. The other thing that I think with land acknowledgements, and then I'll turn it over to Scott, is I like to think that land acknowledgements make a good first half of a second half, which is land back. And I know that may seem like a fairly radical thing to say, but I would encourage you to consider that for a moment. Consider what land back means. Consider what land back might look like. It's not a fantasy. I think at its very foundations, if you're going to engage in Indigenous land acknowledgement and recognize whose land you're on, you also need to think about, is this really land we should be on? And how can we reinvigorate or reassess, or to some extent indigenize our relationships with the land base in a way that is not only beneficial for those Indigenous peoples first and foremost, but I think has huge beneficial components for all of humankind.
I definitely echo all the words that have been shared with us right now by land acknowledgements. Do need to be more than words. We need to see actions behind them as well. Actions such as relationships, research, acknowledging that this isn't covering up something that the trauma of the past. We have to face those. The complexity that we're seeing. There's more than just the land that goes on that's impacted here. When I think about land acknowledgements, yes, it is acknowledging that we are on the land that was occupied by the first peoples of this land. They were the original caretakers of this land. They took care of it so that we can now be here as guests. And yes, we are guests. I am guest here on the Coast Salish Duwamish lands. My ancestors were more in the Great Basin area, the Nez Perce area, the Nimipu is where I come from. So I see myself as a guest. And yes, I want to act like it. I got to make sure I pay respect and not take things that don't belong to me. You got to treat things with respect. So those are some of the actions that we need. And besides it just being someone where someone has to come and hear someone say, we are on this land, and saying which land it's on, we need to be able to see it, not just hear it as well. You know, when I was working on the Seattle School Board, there were starting to do the land acknowledgement, they were picking up then, and then they'd put out signs about, you know, being in a safe place, and I'd noticed that safe place signs would have all different languages that they saw that were spoken here in Seattle, but no Indigenous language. And so I asked, you know, we do these land acknowledgements, but then we don't acknowledge that even though these languages may be vanishing, that we are still on the Duwamish land, the Coast Salish land. Where's the Lushootseed language? And not that everyone's going to understand what it is, but they'll start asking questions. Ooh, which language is that? Then we can start, again, teaching people. And that's where I see land acknowledgements needs to go. Again, actions and teaching people what it means. And to let them know that land acknowledgement is about also the contemporary people that are still here today. You know, we are still here. And if I go back to the Nez Perce land, I can say this is the land that my ancestors grew up on. And I'm proud to be on this place. And I'm proud to be actually here in this land as well.
Well, thank you, all of you, for those really wonderful responses and the challenge as we gather here to talk about these issues, to really think about those next steps and the action behind the words. But focusing a little bit more specifically on Seattle, given the extent to which Native American and Indigenous cultures have become intertwined with this place called Seattle, the name of the city, for example, the City Seahawks logo, which is inspired by traditional Northwest coastal art, the recent bid of not one, but two Indigenous candidates for Seattle mayor, and the planned installation of coastal Salish art along the Seattle waterfront, as well as numerous other examples. I wonder if you could think about and tell us what the future holds or might look like for Indigenous representations in such a place, and what that might mean for honoring the contributions of Indigenous peoples across other parts of the United States. What does this look like in urban communities and in more rural communities?
Reversed it. I'll go first this time. All right. For me, I'd say it says that we're still here. We're seeing, yes, these more people, more Native people identifying when they run for political offices. And yes, we're in the greater Seattle area, and we have a broad representation now, as noted during the announcements about how many tribes we have represented just in the Seattle area and the population, then that we're here. As I know, when I ran for the Seattle School Board, the word came out, oh, Scott Pinkham, the first Native elected to the Seattle School Board, which, boy, that's strange. It took this long for some Native person to be a part of the school board, to be able to share the views and perspectives of a marginalized community. Because too often we're thought as being the vanishing American. We weren't here anymore. There is no true Native living anymore, because we're always seen as that someone in the past, but we're never seen as contemporary people. Even for Seattle, that's the anglicized name of the chief of the Duwamish Suquamish. And excuse me if I pronounce it wrong, but it's Chief Sahal, not Seattle, but Sahal. And we need to be able to take that into consideration when we're going forward. How did we get here? Where are we going? How can we take the views and perspectives of the Native people who are the original stewards of this land to help guide us? And I think about that, where would we be if this land wasn't settled, by the colonizers? Some people get the idea that we would still be in the past, living in wigwams, living in teepees, and no, we would probably continue to change and contribute. We are, contemporary people, and I also get into the battle with some people when they talk about assimilation and adaptation. I say we have adapted. And that's why we're still here. That's why you're still seeing us with the artwork going on. It's contemporary. We're sharing it with others, and we'll continue to do that to forward our cultures and traditions and adapt them as they need to.
I'm glad that Scott brought up stewardship and taking care of the land, because I think that that's a very important component of a lot of what we're talking about here. When I think about what the future holds for Indigenous people and Indigenous representation, having those kinds of dialogues and discussions, especially as a non-Indigenous person myself, the thing that I keep coming back to is the education component. A little bit of a shameless plug for where I spent a significant amount of my life studying in Montana. Montana has what's called Indian Education for All. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of that. And that essentially mandates that in the public school system in the state of Montana, there is a certain degree or amount to which Native American curriculum is mandated in the classroom. So all of those students who come through the public school system in the state of Montana have a degree of education about Native American people, culture, place, relationships, the diversity amongst those Indigenous groups. And that's not something that we see in my home state of Idaho. That's not something that I see out in North Carolina, where I am now. And I think if we were to envision a future where, and there's not really a good way to say this, Native American history is American history. I know that there's some word issues there, okay? But it is American history, and it's really good American history. The stories, the lessons, the opportunities for curiosity, for investigation, to think and to question ourselves and the world around us, it's there. And we've neglected that as non-Indigenous people for a very, very long time. And yet it remains. And yet, I hope it will help to lead us towards a future that is more equitable, more engaged, and celebrates those voices and what they have to offer just as much as we celebrate our current ones.
Crazy Horse is often quoted as saying that there will come a time when the world is dying and they will return to our people to heal the world. I hate to break it to you, but the Industrial Revolution failed, even though it has industrialized medicine, education, military, politics. The Industrial Revolution is over. It's time for a restorative revolution. We have here in Seattle, flying in and listening to people, there are abandoned buildings on the waterfront. There are abandoned buildings in the industrial area. At some point, somebody bought that land and built on it with an endeavor to build something for the community, to create jobs, and now they stand empty. But as sure as we are responsible for every piece of aluminum that we recycle, we need to be equally responsible for every piece of land that we restore. So I think along with the absolutely gorgeous artwork, there needs to be a land-based education where we return the land back to its original state, perhaps to be developed again, because the economy needs certain elements of revitalization, but perhaps to be returned to a green space where we might create certain elements of forage so people can have a certain degree of food sovereignty. So I think the next step beyond some of that artwork and the inclusion and the fantastic representation we see here in Seattle is to start taking back some of those derelict industrial revolution hangovers and restore the land.
You know, I really appreciate what Scott said. You know, being elected to school board as the first Native man to do that, I mean, that is what Seattle is about. So when Eean talks about how in Montana, everybody has at least some semblance of knowledge, right, of Native American history, well, that's due to folks like Denise Juneau, right? Mandan Hidatsa, a Blackfeet woman who was able to transform these systems that have been forced upon us. She was recently the superintendent of public schools here in the city of Seattle. We have Councilmember Deborah Juarez, who's another Blackfeet woman who actually sits on city council, who's made it her personal mission to uplift other Native women in this community. Now, I moved to Seattle about 6 years ago, and I feel so honored every single day because I feel like I'm in this vortex of power and strength and this transition in Indigenous leadership. And that's why you're seeing all of these changes happen. Perhaps imagery is what's most visible to you, but what's most visible to us is the change that we see within our communities. Empowerment, policy, systems. My background is in public policy, and I think about folks like Tayagi Alfred, who wrote the Wasase movement, right? A book on the Wasase movement, which is basically saying you infiltrate the systems that have been forced upon us and you change them from the inside out. And you get them to stand in acknowledgement not only of this land, but of Indigenous people and our strength, and to return to our traditional and cultural ways of being. Now, it's no coincidence that so many Native tribes are represented here in the city of Seattle. Urban relocation programs in the late 1950s or early 1950s were the beginning of that urban Indian establishment. I'm third generation of my family to live in an urban environment. I've never lived on my reservation. I was born and raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I grew up going back and forth between Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. My mom moved back to Arizona a little bit later in life so that she could participate in ceremony more, to participate more with our tribe, right? And that's what it looks like. And so when we think about all of these tribes being assimilated, which is the term that Scott used, when we think of assimilation, we think of boarding schools and we think of things like that, but urban relocation was part of that assimilation. If we could just assimilate Indian people, from their reservation systems, their tribal systems into the mainstream society, then they will eventually not be, the federal government won't be responsible for owing us, right? Taking our land. And instead, what happened is we came together as intertribal communities and we found ways that we could connect. And we found ways that we could strengthen one another, in our own individual identities. And we had aunties who came together and said, just because we're not living on our reservations or in our tribal lands any longer doesn't mean that we're not owed those benefits you promised us for taking our land, right? And that's how organizations like mine were established. As we rose from the social justice movements of the late 1960s, early 70s, and those aunties whose prayers were answered, right? And we came together. And so when I think of Seattle, I think of that. I think of that strength. I think of that, the ways that we stand in our own identities, our own experiences of being Indigenous people, and how we come together and strengthen one another. I think of actually women's leadership. Women are stepping right back into their places of our matriarchal societies and leading and guiding, right? And we're honoring one another in our roles and responsibilities. And I had an auntie once who said, when everybody takes their rightful place in the circle, when everybody stands in their role, regardless of whether you're two-spirit, as a woman, as a man, as youth, as elders, and we stand together in that circle, that's when healing happens, and that's what's happening in Seattle. So when you ask me, what do I see for the future of Seattle? I see strength, I see brilliance, I see leadership, and I see the transformation of Indian country.
So the revitalization of what does it look like for in Seattle? And I just want to uplift everything that everyone said right before me, because I can only add to it because everyone covered it so beautifully. And we're often seen as people of the past, and even into today right now with so many tribes in Washington state, I don't know how many times I've been told that I'm the first Indigenous person that someone has met or has been in their life. And even with all the art and everything, trying to make it present within Seattle and make there be a comfortability, there's still a lot that, I can guarantee that I'm not the first Indigenous person that someone has met, but the first person maybe to come out to share openly that I'm Indigenous, because there's a lot of microaggressions that come along with that as well, right? Like the past, referring to us as past tense, or the series of questions that follow it. And so I think that as much progress as we've made of making the space with art and the start of adding languages to signs, I think it comes with us and how we start engaging with individuals on that relationship level. I think to me that everything comes back to that relationship level of how you engage with someone, and changing that concept in our brain about it being a past tense. It's very much a present tense, and it's very much a future tense. We are moving strong into the future, and we'd like to be referred to as such. We'd like to be thought of as such, and
Well, thank you. And I'm going to hitchhike and pick up many of the threads that you've just talked about. And because, of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, and as Scott referred to, and several of the other folks here, Seattle is home to, many of the tribes and nations. And so it's a sort of a two-part question in terms of, is that pan-Indian identity good or bad or complicated, or what are the implications of that for urban natives? And how does this approach to political organizing impact Native Americans who are organizing for social justice? The second part of that question would be, what does Indigenous sovereignty look like in an urban setting, as you talk about, being future-oriented and moving forward? Whoever, yes?
Okay. I don't believe in pan-Indianism. I think our strength is in our diversity. There are over 565 federally recognized tribes. You have over 250 recognized folks representing those tribes within even the organization that I serve, right? And as I said, it's no coincidence that all of these different tribal people live here. So I think that the brilliance is in diversity. Now, do we always find ways to come together? Yeah. I think about Indian removal, right? And a lot of folks makes me think about Oklahoma, where a lot of tribes were forced to live together, whether or not they were, whether or not they got along. It's kind of how powwow has evolved. It was an intertribal experience where we could put down our differences and get to know one another and learn about one another. And I think that that's one of the reasons that urban Indian communities kind of evolved. So if you think about over 565 federally recognized tribes, and over 70% of all American Indians and Alaska Natives live in urban areas, right? You're gonna find an intertribal experience, but that doesn't mean it's pan-Indian. Pan-Indian is a white term. And so I think that you'll find that in language. So an organization like ours, although we provide health and human services and we have a public health arm, I will tell you that when you speak to community, sometimes they just come to our organization to see other people, to speak their own language, see other Indian faces, right? And that is so valuable. Culture, language, preservation. I mean, when there were calculated efforts to make our practices, language, spiritual practices, traditional healing practices illegal, we have to revitalize that. I think Abriel uses revitalize a lot. And sometimes it's just about sparking that blood memory, because many of us didn't grow up connected always to ceremony or have access or have the ability to go back and forth. And so sometimes that's all we're doing. And sometimes that can occur through another tribe, right? She's speaking Ojibwe language, not the language of her people, but when we come together, you have to spark that memory. And we do that through love and sharing and kindness, not pan-Indianism, right? Even when we respectfully borrow some of those traditions that were gifted to us, we still walk as a guest, So yeah, I don't think that there's really a place for pan-Indianism. I think there's a way that we all find connection regardless of our upbringing, history, background, culture, but it doesn't translate to being homogenous.
Would anyone else like to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll jump on what Esther was saying, because I think I 100% agree, right, that pan-Indianism is not a good thing to promote, to necessarily engage with, and yet for a majority perhaps of non-Indigenous people in this country, that is what they consume, right? That is what they see in their representations. And I'm reminded of an exercise I did earlier this semester with my students where we were talking about representations in media and how important that is, especially for underrepresented and minoritized groups. And we looked, and this has a pro and a con too, okay? We looked first at the original Peter Pan. And I asked my students, what do you see in these representations of these native people, these mythicized people, okay? We went through that, we talked about it, we talked about how these representations were problematic, how that contributes to mental health, self-determination, okay? And then, and if you haven't seen this, I highly recommend you watch it, we watched Reservation Dogs. And I asked them the same questions. What do you see in these representations? They said, well, I see people. I see diversity. And they had a hard time pinning down any one particular thing when we compared those representations. And I'm not saying that one TV show changes the world, right? But we do have, and we are seeing, more and more opportunities given to Indigenous people to tell their own story in that kind of medium that can be exposed, that can be shared, that can challenge some of those narratives to engage in the exact kind of things that Esther's talking about, to deconstruct those problematic representations that are associated with Pan-Indianism. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll speak my piece, is as part of my dissertation, I was working with the Blackfeet, the Amskapi Pikani in Glacier National Park in Montana. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. And one of the things that's really interesting about Glacier National Park is that when you go into the park on the east side, you're coming from the traditional lands of the Blackfeet. You go into the park, you're still on the traditional lands of the Blackfeet. And what greets you at the lodge, at the visitors' travel lodge? Totem poles. There's no reason for there to be totem poles there, okay? Not appropriate, not representative, and yet for the millions of tourists that pour through that park every summer, that's what they see. That's what they leave with, is those images of totem poles.
Yeah, Pan-Indian, as kind of Esther is talking about, it's more a non-native, term, the Pan-Indian identity, and it could have some good connotations and bad connotations. The bad being that all Indians are the same. They're all the same. There's just one type. There's not the diversity of the cultures just within the number of nations here. The good is talking about when they do come together, when they were forced to go to reservations with other nations, when they're forced to go to boarding schools with other nations, that they couldn't speak their language anymore, so they started coming up with other ways. How do we adapt? How do we adapt so we make sure that we survive? That word survive, resilience, perseverance. And Harold Visner said, came up survivance. And that's what natives are doing, the survivance. We're still here. Yes, you tried to assimilate us in certain ways. The injustices that happen to us, that's common amongst many of the native nations, the injustices that were put upon us. So if we look at that Pan-Indian identity, yeah, you put us through the same things. So that's what we have in common, and how we now have to rise up to address those injustices, the social justice movements, so that we can hopefully recover what was lost, but not through a Pan-Indian identity, but through the individual tribal needs. What the Nez Perce people need is different than what my wife's people, the Tlinkits, need, what they want to recover, what we want to continue on. We need to acknowledge that. But then we need the tribes to work together. We've worked together in the past. We can't be battling against one another. We need to be together and support, yes, each other's unique needs. Righting those injustices, done through cultural revitalization. And I know we're going to talk about this later as we go on. When I look at the since time immemorial curriculum that's come up and adopted in the state of Washington, that was put up by many of the tribes coming together to say, we need more than just what's taught in the current history books. We need to have our voices shared. So that's a step forward where, again, showing that tribes can come together and kind of relate to that past questions about seeing more natives running for political offices to share our voice. And yes, it may be a tribal member from a certain tribe that's running, but they have to know they are representing others as well. And I'm proud to see them going up there. Deb Haaland being named to the Secretary of Interior. My brother got appointed with the Biden administration as well. We're still here, and our voices are being heard, and I think we're going to rise everyone up.
I see, as we've heard everyone kind of mention, that the relationship to the word Pan-Indian isn't Indigenous, it's not Native, it's very much an outside view on what someone's seeing, and I see it as kind of a tactic of colonization, and an intentional tactic of colonization. So I was born and raised here in Seattle, but as I mentioned before, my tribe isn't from Washington, it's not from Seattle, mine's from up north, but my relationship to the tribes here and being a good guest and celebrating the traditions and the relationships to the land that we're on right now, and the tribe's relationship to the land and how they celebrate it and how they how the medicines that they use, like me adopting that and celebrating that and uplifting that because that's the environment I'm in. Someone, whether it's a lack of ability to identify that when they initially saw tribal people, the diversity of tribal people, could be described as ignorance, to not be able to come up with different terminology or identify that in a different way other than Pan-Indianism, or it could be an intentional tactic of dehumanizing the diversity of all of these people, the diversity of all these cultures and all these different types of relationships. And that tactic is to dehumanize, because it's much easier to try to take out one group of people versus saying that you're taking out the diversity across an entire landscape of hundreds of different nations with different traditions and cultural backgrounds and richness. It's a lot easier to say that you're taking out one group of Pan-Indianism versus 500 individual tribes.
Yesterday, just north of us, RCMP stormed Wet'suwet'en Sovereign Nation because they were protesting a pipeline. The Canadian government has said, well, it's because the other nations approved it. It's the Wet'suwet'ens who are, or that particular area that is standing in the way of progress. The danger of utilizing a term like Pan-Indian means that we, and I'm going to use my communication scholar hat, we decrease or eliminate advocacy and we erase agency. So for those who are not communication scholars in the room, imagine being forcibly silenced because someone has misassumed your heritage. It is not the first time this has happened, and it has not happened only to Indigenous peoples. Think of the many nations that were forcibly removed from Africa to many, many other nations with which they were not familiar. Their identities, their cultures erased and forced to take on a separate identity. This is not a new tactic. But instead of those individuals being able to recognize their unique and sovereign identity, they are painted with one singular term, and it is an academic term that I hope we can find an alternative for. This is a challenge to you rhetoricians, this BIPOC term that we have used, because it is the same as Pan-Indian. So I want to challenge my fellow scholars in the room. Let's find a new term.
I'd like to speak to the tribal sovereignty piece. As you asked a very interesting question, which is tribal sovereignty. And again, I'm having a hard time gauging the room and the knowledge base, so I'll just say the definition of sovereignty is the right to create laws and govern themselves. And if you think back to pre-colonization, our tribal societies already had their own systems of government. And there was one point where the federal government acknowledged that, so now we still have nation-to-nation agreements, right? And so we work nation-to-nation. Now, the question was, how does that play out in cities, right, urban areas? Now, in the state of Washington, it's really unique because we've adopted here what they call the Centennial Accord, which is a state-level recognition of tribal sovereignty and commitment to maintaining tribal sovereignty. Now, we also had a city proclamation that acknowledges tribal sovereignty with a commitment to honor tribal sovereignty. That's really unique. That doesn't happen in a lot of places because technically our relationship as tribes is with the federal government, right? And so I would say that we as an urban Indian health program are an extension of tribal sovereignty through the healthcare delivery system. And we work with our 29 federally recognized tribes very closely. They think of us as an extension of the health services that serve people who've moved to the urban areas. And so they've sometimes included us in their sovereign rights. Like, for example, when we were addressing the COVID response, right? We had a lot of authority and autonomy of how we actually distributed the vaccine because of the tribes. And so I would say that it depends, again, on what Abriel keeps harping on, which is relationships. And because we as an urban program and as urban people work really hard to have good relationships with our tribal partners, we have been really blessed with the strength of tribal sovereignty.
Well, I want to pick up again on a few of the themes. A few of you have mentioned the importance of language, and so I'd like to pursue that a little bit as well as link that to some other communication challenges. So can you speak to the importance of native languages in the greater Seattle area, especially since this is an area which is one of the top 5 areas in the world for language loss? So what does language revitalization look like? And why is it important? And then also, what are some of the other challenges in the Indigenous and Native Seattle communities where communication might help address these issues? So yeah, whomever, yeah, please go ahead.
So I can't say too much about language revitalization from within the Seattle or Greater Seattle area, but I had the very fortunate opportunity during my undergraduate experience. I got a degree in Native American Studies, and part of that degree was learning to speak the Arapaho language, which is a tribe from Wyoming, if you're not familiar. And the way that we learned to speak Arapaho was purely through visuals and oral learning. We didn't have a textbook. We didn't learn to read or write it. We learned to speak it to each other. And part of what was so powerful about that was that, and we've spoken about this before on this panel, is it created relationships. Created relationships between myself and the other speakers from other tribes, not Arapaho. And we all bonded and grew in part because of that connection that we then had. Now, one of the things for me as a non-Indigenous person that was mind-blowing at the time, okay, was that in some of these languages, many of these languages, I don't want to say all, they conjugate a great number of their words based on what's sometimes referred to as a grammar of animacy. Whether or not something has life, okay? And not necessarily just to the extent that it's life, but the role that things, people, creations play in a sacred way to those people. So when you talk in Blackfoot, when you talk about certain rocks, Niskim, buffalo calling stones, those are alive because there's a story that traces that back in the Blackfeet cosmology to important pieces of who they are and where they came from and how they survived upon the land that they survived upon. And so I think when we talk about Indigenous language revitalization, and we ask ourselves, to what extent is this important? It's, in my opinion, the number one most important thing to get behind and to advocate for, is to save these Indigenous languages before they're lost. There's so much knowledge there. There's so much understanding and respect and admiration for the world in these languages. And the rate at which these languages are becoming endangered, that elders are passing away, and words are lost every time an elder passes. I think the importance with which efforts need to be organized to support language revitalization is of the utmost importance. I'm not sure where I want to go from there, so if somebody else wants to pick up.
Thank you, Eean. You are an ally. I appreciate your words. And I would have said the same thing. That is where the knowledge lies, in the language. You know, English is my first language. I don't know my Nez Perce Nimipu language, but I'm trying to learn it. And as I learn it, yes, you find more knowledge there. What they would call the plants, the trees, the fauna, and how they saw things would change from seasons or the needs that were there, it was in their language. And as we try to interpret it from one language to another, we lose part of it. It's not there. Now, fortunately, we are seeing some scientists and research start looking at the native languages, especially with the melting ice caps. What happened up there? Let's go to the indigenous people, see what they saw back there. What they call the various ice and snow and melting there. Did they have different words for it to help understand what's happening, what changes are occurring? Unfortunately, for me, again, the Nez Perce language, it wasn't a written language. As Eean was saying, it's through talking and sharing, not writing it down, not learning how to read it, but through revitalization efforts, the Nez Perce tribe did adopt a phonetic alphabet to try to preserve the language. I'm hearing about other tribes that truly lost their language, but are working with neighboring tribes and trying to use their dialects to recreate their language that was lost. Just here in the Seattle area, Lashutsi, there are 2 different dialects. There could be more than 2. In northern and southern is usually what I hear about. And sometimes there can be definitely competitions or competing about how to say a certain word. Well, that's the southern dialect, that's the northern dialect. That happens with the Nez Perce tribe as well. But revitalizing, for me, it's because that's where the knowledge lies. We need to get it back and bring it so that we can better the education, not for just the tribes, but for everyone.
I am a rhetorician, classical rhetorician by training, so I pay attention to words. And the one thing that I have stopped saying is that a language is lost. It was stolen. It doesn't matter who stole it. It doesn't matter how it was decimated. It wasn't lost. It wasn't something misplaced. So language matters. There is a word in Ojibwe for conversation. And conversation in English is sort of a dull word. But in Ojibwe, kimanato manooshi is that it comes from spirit. That's a completely different concept. So the preservation of language, the revitalization of language, means that we are all richer for it. It's not just those who are reclaiming their birthright of language. There are so many apps out there. You can pick a language from your area where you're from and learn a few words. And I guarantee you it will enrich you mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I do appreciate it's hard. Learning language is very hard. But I hope that along with taking the next steps on a land acknowledgement statement, that learning bits of the language are a nice next step.
I think for me, so Navajo Nation is known for our language, right? And the strength of our language. And so I think when I think about the fact that I don't speak our language very well, like maybe like a 3-year-old, it brings me a lot of shame. And it is hard. I mean, I don't know if anybody has ever heard Navajo, but we've got a glottal sound that is very challenging when you've spoken English your entire life. And yes, I can look at it theoretically and know why this has occurred, and and still, I want to be able to introduce myself in my language. I want to be able to connect with my clan relatives. I want to be able to connect with ceremony through language. And so, revitalization, I think, is really key. And I think that there's got to be some acknowledgement for the pain it causes to try to get there.
So, I also don't speak my language, and I struggle with that. And one of the things that I struggle with that is that language is a carrier of culture, and it's also a carrier of community norms and community values. And those often, the community Indigenous values are often contradictory to westernized, colonized values. And so, again, in that translation, going back and forth between Indigenous language and the values that you were brought up with at home, that stem from that language, that stem from that culture, that live within how you relate to each other. The language, the Indigenous languages often have a different way of relating to each other, and I think that that's one of the beautiful things that Seattle Indian Health Board implements, is that everyone is referred to as a relative, and that changes how you look at people, that changes how I relate to you, that changes how I relate to you if I think of you as my relative. And a lot of the languages, Indigenous languages, sometimes they don't have a difference, a distinguishing difference between my dad and my uncle. So someone who is my dad is also my uncle, or someone who is my nephew is also my son. So there's that relationship that really bonds people together, and that changes in different ways. It changes the perspective human to human. It changes the perspective to the land, and it changes the perspective to our animal relatives, right? And so it's harder to treat them with disrespect if you think of them as family. And I also want to touch on, you mentioned challenges in community with communication. And some of the challenges that I think our community is facing right now is that our norms aren't being normalized within business. Our norms and our values within our culture are very contradictory to what is allowed within business languages or contracts. And we often, again, we're going to go back to relationships, and to use an example with land acknowledgements. If you're going to go to an Indigenous community and ask them to help co-develop a land acknowledgement with you, but then you don't use any of their self-narrative language, or you don't use any of the words that come out of their mouth directly, that's not reflecting that relationship. And if we can't do that in business, if you go to an Indigenous community and you're asking for input, but then you change those terms to be more westernized, business-related terms, that gets lost in the translation. Just like Indigenous languages to English, those are community values. And if they're already code switching between how they engage with each other within their own community, and they're trying to code switch but be genuine with you, and you're then code switching it to another degree, something in there gets lost. So part of that challenge is not using the language that the community gives you yourself. If you're going to go back and ask them, this is what we got from you, this is what we heard, is this what you were trying to relay to us? And if none of that language that came out of their mouth is there, you're not doing something right. That relationship isn't being built, and that relationship isn't being honored. So the language revitalization to Indigenous languages is extremely important, as well as honoring what we share in English language to you and not making us code switch it. That side, that business side, that ability to relate to each other on a business level, that needs to be honored and respected and supported.
Thank you. Those are just amazingly thoughtful comments, and we have so much more that we could talk about. We're nearing the end of our time, and so I was trying to think what might be a good final question to maybe invite a few of you to give us some quick thoughts on. And of course, I want to return us to the title of the session, right, which is Honoring Past and Present, Communication, Culture, and Change. And here we are in the midst of an academic conference. So maybe as a way to wrap up our session, a few thoughts about what do we do in the academy to honor the past and the present as we go forward from this moment back to our departments and communities and classrooms and students. And so maybe a few quick thoughts.
I actually want to jump all over this one.
You have 2 minutes.
I have 2 minutes, great. The National Communication Association, this is its 107th convention. That is a long-standing commitment to effective communication. Historically, NCA has been an advocate for other individuals who have lacked agency. We have changed the language around LGBTQ2S, and it started in this community, within communication. We have changed the language around inclusion to inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, accommodation. That started here. So honoring our past means I want to honor each and every one of you, NCA members, for doing that work, because it has not gone unnoticed. But as you well know, the work is not done. Language is constantly changing. So how do we go forward with the challenges of communication, particularly in a technology-enriched environment? We really need to examine accessibility. We really need to examine connection and relationship. We really need to examine accommodation. If we really want diversity and inclusion, we need to examine how our structures include others, how our structures invite agency.
Well, thank you so very much to all of you for this wonderful discussion and just the excellent contributions. And I know I've enjoyed learning so much, and I hope that you in the audience have as well. And once again, my deep appreciation to our sponsor, the Waterhouse Family Institute for the Study of Communication, and to all of you for attending today. So please join me in giving our panelists a really wonderful round of applause. Thank you so very much. Please get up, interact, come meet our panelists. We have 15 minutes, and then we can head to our reception, but it may be open sooner than that. So I hope to see you there, and I want to wish you all a wonderful rest of the conference. So let's go celebrate. Thank you.